Hey, this is Clark with Pass the Baton, where we want to pass along the faith, pass along the study of the scriptures, instead of just keeping it all to ourselves. We don't want to be in a marathon, we're in a relay, and that's what this channel is about. In Christianity, in Bible study, that's what we want to really encourage, is studying the Bible, learning from it. Today, I want to talk about the right hand of God. Kind of a surprising, I would call surprising, portion or a surprising reason why Jesus is sitting at the right hand of God. I know I've heard, and it is true, that this is because it's a sign of power, it's a sign of authority. And in the scriptures, we see that. We see, for instance, in one place in the New Testament, when James and John literally look at Jesus and say, "Can you give us one on the right hand and one on the left?" They knew that there was something about power being on the right and the left hand. And of course, at that time, Jesus doesn't deny that someone will be sitting on the right and left hand. He simply says, that's up to God. He said he'll decide who's sitting on the right and the left hand. And of course, we see a few instances also in the Old Testament, like in the Psalms, when it's and we see that Psalms quoted again in the New Testament. See a lot about the right hand, about how, and literally, right hand is kind of a symbol of, probably was a symbol of strength, because more people were right-handed. You usually did things with the right hand. Mark chapter 16, when it gets to Jesus, after Jesus has died, this is what it says: "After the Lord had spoken to them, he was taken up into heaven and set down at the right hand of God." So this is, in this context, Jesus has died, he's resurrected, he's come back, and then his ascension takes place. His ascension is actually different than his resurrection. It's different than his second coming, but his ascension is when he goes up after his 40 days on the earth. And after he went up, it says, then he sat down on the right hand of God. This is Mark, right after that, and it goes into Acts, literally in the book of Acts, which is the continuation of that part of the story, as Luke writes it. In that part of Acts, in the first part, it goes into the kind of the same thought, some of that part about being on the right hand of God, about ascending up into heaven. See it in different places. In the book of 1 Peter, in chapter 3, he said, "Who is gone into heaven and is on the right hand of God, angels and authorities and powers being made subject to him." So reading verses like that, obviously it does allude to the fact that it is a symbol of power. It's authority. He is at the right hand of the king. He is there. If someone says he's my right hand man or something along those lines, it would mean he is of utmost importance to me. He is someone who, kind of has my authority to do what he needs to do. That would kind of be what he's talking about. But in the book of Hebrews, I think we see another reason, and I call it surprising because it's kind of different a lot of times than what you hear, although once you hear me say it, it's going to be kind of like common sense in a sense that this is kind of what you would think of when he says he's sitting on the right hand of God. So in the book of Hebrews, which, by the way, I've said this before, I've taught through different portions of Hebrews before, but it's probably my favorite book, and it really brings out the Old Testament into the New Testament. It kind of gives you that fulfillment of what it was for. It talks about the Old Covenant, the New Covenant. And this is how it starts. Long ago, many times, and this is the ESV, and I'm probably not exactly reading, I may just kind of go through this quickly, but it says, "God had spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed to heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of the God and the exact imprint of his nature." It goes on to say, "After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high." So the book of Hebrews starts with that thought, that he was the priest. He was a priest, and he would sit down on the right hand of the Majesty on high, which of course is referring to God. Now Jesus is the only one that was priest and king. In theory, I guess you could look at other people to say might have fulfilled that roles, but not really. And in Jewish times, you had the lineage of Judah, which was the lineage of the kings, because it was kind of like a monarchy, and then it would be passed on from father to son. It went through Judah, the lineage of Judah. The Levitical group was the priesthood. So Jesus couldn't fulfill both in that sense, and that's why in the book of Hebrews, when you get over in the chapter I think maybe chapter 5 and 6 may mention a little bit about it, but in chapter 7, he talks about the priesthood and the order of Melchizedek. And he had to come after the order of Melchizedek, as Hebrews 7 points out, because Melchizedek wasn't from the lineage of Judah. He was a priest. He was appointed to that office, yet he didn't have a lineage. It says not having a father or mother. Personally, I don't think that means he didn't have a father or mother. I think it means they just didn't know who it was. Like something like 13 or 14 times in the Bible, it talks about something being without weight or without number, something along those lines. And that's impossible. Everything's going to have a number, anything that you can count. It's not into infinity. So the point was they didn't know how many or how big or whatever. So you kind of have that precedent. When it says he's without father or mother, they just simply don't know who it is. And so Jesus would be after the order of Melchizedek. In other words, he was from Judah, lineage of Judah, yet he would fulfill the priesthood. Now a king represents God to the people, but a priest represents the people to God. Jesus would fulfill both roles. And the priest, in the Old Testament, the priest, and really he's going to talk about it here in the Hebrews, which is one reason I love the Hebrews. It kind of summarizes what that Old Testament, all the law and all that stuff was about. Chapter 8, Hebrews, starts out, says, now, the point in what we are saying is this. Now, what he had just talked about was the priesthood. How the priests were many in number. They did their office. They did all these things. Were performed their sacrifices daily. And going into once a year into the Holy of Holies. And chapter 8 says, now the point in what we're saying, the point of this priesthood, is that we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. So he's saying there is a priest now who has completed that task. He has finished that task. And in chapter 8, we'll continue on talking about the priest. It says they serve, verse 5 says they serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. So what they did on earth as in their priesthood, going in through the temple, it was just a shadow of what was in heaven. Literally, when he gave Moses the specifications on how to build the tabernacle and on, he was saying it was a shadow. It was a shadow of something that's in heaven. So something in heaven is much like what they had here on earth, only it's heavenly and this was earthly. And that's the difference in literally in worldly and spiritually. If it's made here, and even those things that went into the tabernacle were called worldly. It was called a worldly sanctuary in chapter 9 of Hebrews. He said, and it was in contrast to a heavenly, not made with hands, temple in the heaven. So what the priest did here was a pattern of things that would be done in heaven. And you can continue reading through chapter 8, and it's talking about these sacrifices. And verse 13 says, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. Now that's a strong word, and it's a word that's not mentioned in the King James, but I think it says something like waxing old or something along those lines. But the word literally means obsolete. And when Jesus made something obsolete, that means you don't do it anymore. You don't have to do it anymore. And the old covenant was made obsolete. What the priest did by making their sacrifices, by the people bringing in their sacrifices, by the priests performing their rituals, by performing their things in the temple, that is made obsolete. The Old Testament in that sense was made obsolete. He said, what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. Of course, this was at a time when Jesus has already ascended. At this time, I don't think the temple has been torn down yet. There's different theological studies on that, but more than likely the temple, which was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans, was probably still standing. That's why it was going to vanish away quickly, because they were still making their sacrifices at the temple. Now, if a Jewish person thinks they can be saved by keeping the sacrifices, it is impossible, because they do not have a temple. And that's what Jesus was alluding to, that he would be the sacrifice. So now, continues to go through chapter 9. It says, first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness. And that goes into what I just said about it was earthly, it was worldly. Talks about the tent was prepared, the first section. Then it's going to tell you what's in it. The lampstand, the table of the bread, the holy place. Behind the second curtain, the most holy, was the golden altar, the Ark of the Covenant, the golden urn holding the manna, and the tablets of the covenant, and the cherubim which overshadowed it. So it's telling us exactly what was in the tabernacle, which would later be in the temple. And this was a shadow of things, of course, and it says these things were there. But there's something that is not there. There's no chair. The priests were not allowed to sit. They had to perform their ritual standing, and it was as if they would be continually on the move. If you remember from the Passover, they gave them unleavened bread because they said they would have to, they would have to keep walking. They would, they wouldn't let anything rest under their feet. They had to go, and the priest would be moving continually, and it was a constant thing. The giving of the sacrifices was constant. Not only were there yearly sacrifices where the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, but there was different Sabbath sacrifices. There was monthly sacrifices of the new moon. There was some weekly sacrifices, and there were daily sacrifices. Even in the morning, there were sacrifices upon sacrifices that never stopped. And the priests were continually performing these rituals. They were continually draining the blood. They were continually, with this literally dirty job that they had to do, they would perform them day after day, week after week, month after month, and year after year. And he talks about this. He sums this up about how Christ would be the new mediator of a new covenant. In chapter 9, it says, at one point in chapter 9, says in verse 11, but when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater one, more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. That was the point of what Jesus did. It wasn't the high priest who could never sit. There was no chair in that temple, in that tabernacle. And then Jesus, of course, is a shadow, which it says in chapter 10, says, for since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come, of the true form of these realities. It said it could never make the person sinless. It could never save them. And that's literally what it says. It says it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. It's impossible. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, and then of course he talks about his sacrifices and offerings that he would do. It says, he said, above, you've never desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings. And this is what he was talking about that Jesus would do. It says, and every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. It's like the writer, whether it's Paul or whether it's somebody else, it's like they're just saying, this could never work. They continue to do this day in, day out, but it could not work. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. So the surprising reason Jesus sat on the right hand of God is because he's finished. His job was done. He did what he came to do. He made the eternal sacrifice, and that is what you can rest in. And it says until. So you say, well, how long is he going to sit there? And he answers this, and he's quoting from an Old Testament passage here, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. So he's going until all enemies are under his feet. He is sitting on the right hand of God. And the only time, you see time after time after time in the New Testament, Jesus sitting on the right hand of God. The only time he's standing is in Stephen's vision, the first martyr, as he's persecuted and says, and he's telling him, he said, I saw Jesus standing on the right hand of God. So no doubt Jesus is finished, but when a believer comes home, it is so precious to him that he's willing to stand and receive them home. But his job is done. He can, and the writer to Hebrews goes into this a little more detail, but it cannot be done again. It says if you've sinned after receiving this, he said there's no more sacrifice. In other words, it's already done. It's already covered. Jesus has finished it. His job is done. Jesus sat down on the right hand of God because he is done with what he came to do. Just like in the creation, in the beginning of the world, God created all things through the 6 days, and then he rested on the seventh. Then man messed it up, and from then on, the plan was that Jesus would redeem them again, and once Jesus did that job to redeem them again, He did the same thing God did. He rested. And he sit on the right hand of God, and now ever to be a mediator for us, but he's sitting because the job of redeeming mankind is done. It is finished. We have a tendency, I wrote this down, we have a tendency to wait on God when in reality he is waiting on us. He is there and he's waiting, and when we come home, according to Stephen's vision, he will stand up and welcome us there. So this, I think, just studies, and I kind of studied this a little before, but I think in studying this is kind of a surprise reason, so to speak, of why Jesus is sitting on the right hand of God. It's not just because it's a place of power. It's not because he's a king. In reality, his priestly job is done. His sacrifice has been made, and no priest before that could ever sit. No sacrifice was ever complete. But once Jesus offered his blood as the eternal sacrifice, it was done, and he sit down on the right hand of God, and it's over, and no more will he have to do that again. I hope you just learned a little. Maybe you want to look up some, maybe you just want to read through Hebrews. It's such an interesting book, but I hope it just encourages you to study, to get into a little bit more, to help pass the baton. And until next time.